everybody. Again, some of you. As I've been in schools today, it's just really been a full day. So I'm excited to be here with you guys this evening. Also, just like a quick scan, I'm also thinking about who was in the room with us for Parent University 1. I see Mom Luva. How you doing? Anyone else who was able to make it that night? Okay. Got you. Okay, so for those of you who were with us the last time, as Dr. Payne just offered, we did do a lot of unpacking what our citation has meant, what the work around disproportionality has been, the work towards more equitable outcomes for our students in Greece has been, right? And there was a lot of feedback from the parents in the room, specifically around being heard, specifically around how to really be engaged to address issues, again, of inequities in the district in a constructive way, right? So what I was able to offer was all that Greece is really pushing through in terms of everything from having me here to work with district and then work with teachers and then turnkey the work so you all can really take it on as your own, have parents step into roles that allow other parents to feel empowered, right? We talked about all of that. One of the things we really wanted to get to was how a deeper understanding of disproportionality could start to impact how parents continue to engage, right, in a very important way in the district so that this work really becomes systemic. You don't want it to be, right, and Greece is already doing that in terms of, I no longer run a CRE session, right? I'm able to step in, support, but the work is really being handled by Greece. So Greece is very much taking care of Greece as we move forward. However, parents are a key part of that. And what we don't want to underestimate is how powerful families can be in this process. So one of the things that we do when we're talking about equity in any district is to think about moments of vulnerability. And what we consider, hoping I can get it, we have a few like technical issues, so you guys bear with us. A dual access model of vulnerability. So those of you who have done any of this work around CRE, right, have seen this before. Am I right for the folks from district and principal leadership? You guys have seen this before. And I just want everybody, if you can see it, even the small print, it's odd. We didn't stretch out the quadrants very well. But if you could just give yourself a second to glance that before I start to talk about it a little bit. So before I go any further, does everyone in the room understand what disproportionality is and how it sort of manifests itself in Greece, GCSD in particular? And if you do, would you be willing to share your perspective to the rest of the group? Because I'm hearing a little silence, so who feels like they've got a grasp and they can talk about it a little bit from a Greece perspective? Okay, and tell me your name and... Jessica?
Yeah.
Okay, Jessica.
Probably because of the shifting in the house market, you know, people wanting better for their kids, other people moving, people decide that, and then you have them raising their kids, and so you're getting a lot of different, so to say, backgrounds, but you still want to have a level of expectancy that they're going to hit, like markers.
Okay.
But coming from just a whole pool of, you know, well, we used to do this and we don't do that anymore. We used to, you know, just the whole change, a whole variance of change, I guess, for the district.
So changes in who our students are here in Greece?
Yeah.
And maybe then shifting expectations from the adults in terms of these changing students. Okay. So disproportionality in terms of changing expectations, academic expectations maybe, some social expectations. Okay, anybody else can fill in on disproportionality, how you see it in Greece, and what it really means in Greece. I have some heavy hitters in here, so I expect some answers. I'm like over here with you guys, but that's okay if you don't want to say anything. Anybody else who can speak to how we would explain disproportionality? Yes.
I think unequal outcomes for kids who are in the same place, you know, the same school or same classes. We're seeing unequal outcomes. So our first citation was around suspensions and rates of suspensions for our Black students. But I think as we've worked as a district to look across different measures, we're seeing that disproportionate in every measure that we're looking at, in many measures that we're looking at.
Okay, so disproportionality in terms, and also Jessica, in terms of what you're talking about, like different outcomes for different children. And so disproportionate outcomes, right? We entered the district, NYU entered the district to really address the issue of, and I'll take this hand before I go in. Yes.
I was going to say just another example of disproportionality. I like to walk around my building and look into the classrooms, and I walk into a Regents level classroom and I see a very good ethnic breakdown, something that is very, I would say, proportionate to what Greece is as a whole, a microcosm of the United States in terms of the backgrounds. But then I go into an AP or an IB classroom and I see a very different makeup. I see mainly white faces. And I say that's very disproportionate. And one of my visions I hope to have down the road is a classroom, an IB or an AP classroom that matches the ethnic breakdown of Greece as a whole.
Okay. And so one piece that, and so all of this coming together is very helpful, right? Because one piece I do want to point out is that the citation is a discussion around disproportionate outcomes, having AP classes maybe with all of your white students and maybe some, as an example, and then maybe some of your 8 to 1-to-1 or other special ed classes with boys who are Black, right? But be very clear that the citation does not address ethnicity. It actually addresses issues of race and gender, and then yes, designation in terms of special ed. So the citation we became, you know, in contact with Greece with was specifically around Black male students and how much they were over-identified in terms of suspensions and special ed. Jeremy.
I think another important piece is always to know the total enrollment of that population. So when you're looking and comparing, two numbers may look the same, but if your total enrollment of a certain group is much lower, but the number's the same, that's where you get into your disproportionality. So it's always comparing to, what I think at least, is looking at total enrollment.
So being able to contextualize the numbers. You're not looking at raw data in just terms of raw numbers. You have to place it in ratios, right? You have to place it in terms of how many groups, how many students in each racial group are present in your district. So I hope that that gives a little more information around how we understand disproportionality. And then as we get through this evening, one of the things I want this group to think about is why that matters, why it's something that we have to unpack as a district, why we have to look into other ways in which we can identify disproportionality of the district and address it, and how that improves the academic outcomes of all students. Not just the students where we find disproportionality attached to one group, right? But all of the students, how much they benefit when we start to look at issues around race, racism, right? Or when you have a teacher population that really struggles with how to connect with all of their students. Not just one group, but all of their students, and again, why that matters. So, you have questions tonight, but you can almost like turn those over for now, for what we're about to do. If you could just turn those papers over, everybody. Okay. What I want you to look at right now is the screen, because I want you to think about how you've just unpacked disproportionality a little bit, and this dual axis model of vulnerability. Why? Because we've already talked about what disproportionality is, how the district is addressing it, and now we're saying, again, why does it matter, and how vulnerable are children when we ignore disproportionality, or more importantly, when we sort of address it, but we don't make system changes that will be long-lasting in a district. And I think how parents play a part in moving children around to the quadrant that we'd like them to be in on this dual axis of vulnerability, okay? So, if we look up at the top left, where we have a risk factor level, it's pretty high. And we see that students in this section have low protective factors. Can I ask the group how you understand that? Like, who those students are. What is a student with low protective or high risk factors? What would be a high risk factor for one of your students in Greece? Unstable housing. What else? And can everybody hear these answers? What would make a student have a high risk factor? What would be a high risk factor for one of your students in Greece? Economically disadvantaged, unstable housing. What else? Trauma.
Lack of role models.
Lack of role models. Okay. Anyone else?
The race, I mean, being black in Greece is a risk factor.
Being black in Greece is a risk factor. Okay, then give me a little bit more with that, and not just down that line, but right, we've named a few. So being black and being a male, right, being a boy. Okay. If we understand that, if we can start to identify, right, what some of the higher risk factors are for those students, right, who has control over this other side, right, the protective factor level? In this room in particular, who has control over how best to increase protection or decrease protection, right? Because it has to meet up with this risk that you've just identified. I've heard role models, I've heard housing, staff, right? And I see a little bit of like that's a given. These answers are not givens in terms of this work, right? Because it's very hard for the adults in districts sometimes to address the risk, right, which causes disproportionality often. It's really hard to directly address those risks. So what we want you to think about is what role you play in increasing the protection for these students. So tell me again, how do we increase protective factors for students? So teachers, and what else did someone say?
Engaging parents.
Engaging parents. Okay, so if parents are a part of this, I have parents in the room, how do parents increase protective factors for their children in a school district? Voice, having a voice, using their voice.
Participation.
Participation, give me an example of participation in a district.
PTA, parent-teacher conferences, calling the teacher if you have an issue, being there to support your child beyond sports.
Coming to this?
Coming to this? Okay. Okay. So as we identify those pieces, right, and they again, it's an axis, so at some point they're going to meet. Where is the disconnect? Where is it that the voice can be heard, right, or it's not being heard, as was offered in the last meeting, right? Where is it that these pieces can be identified? They seem very obvious to people. Oh, well, parents can have a voice, parents can join a PTA, parents can attend a parent university, and we can very clearly identify the risk factors. You all were very clear about that. We can probably even picture who those students are right now if we really think about it. But this process is kind of doing this. You know how you're supposed to rub your tummy and pat your head? I can't do this at the same time. But we're not meeting. We're not making a connection in terms of decreasing risk and increasing protective factors for our students, which is definitely a root cause leading us to more disproportionality in the district or struggling with how to address it. So Parent University gives us this opportunity to start to talk about that with parents, district, and teachers in the room. So that's why we're here. Who can identify a child who's in a lower risk factor, but still with lower protective factors? So this quadrant over here, I'm going to tell you why I'm asking. We've lowered their risk, but they still have low protective factors. How many principals do I have in the room? So you guys should be able to tell me something. Tell me, you don't have to give me the child's name, but give me an initial. Give me who can be in this space, right here. And if you're a parent, tell me if you know a friend of your child, if it's your child that you feel like is in this space, right here. Masked vulnerability. No one?
I'm gonna take a guess.
Go for it, there's no wrong answer.
So possibly a bright child with not too much support at home.
Okay, so that means, again, you're sticking to that, which I asked you to do. Lower protective factors still, but we've lowered their risk, and their risk is lowered because you said they were bright, so they're able to do well academically in a setting. Who else, and thank you for that, Jessica, who else can give me someone who's here?
There's students who have a trusted adult in their life that they are connected to, that they trust, and that they will seek out if they need help.
Okay, so a trusted adult, right, moves them from this space of high vulnerability, right, completely, like just high risk factors, right? We've moved them over to the right because we've lowered, just by having an adult that they can connect with, right? We don't know if that ultimately means an academic outcome that's going to be fabulous, but we know we've added a protective factor. What else, or who else is that child? Yes, and tell me your name.
Stephanie.
Stephanie.
Could the shade of their skin, if they weren't as dark, if they were lighter, if they had...
Okay, so I find that interesting in terms of colorism and how blackness is perceived, and the blacker you are, how much more of a threat you are, the larger you are, including that blackness makes you more threatening. That's interesting to me, and I do think it matters. So I'm going to add that you're saying if the child maybe looks a little more white or is white, am I stepping too far when I say that? Okay, so we're lowering their risk when we move them towards being white or just a lighter black child.
Yeah, the first CRB cohort, you know, we had a couple of the teachers who were perceived as white even though they were black, and their experiences were different based on how they were perceived.
Okay, that's very interesting, and you guys unpack that in CRE. Okay, so I agree with you. I think it's interesting to imagine how the room will respond to that, so I look forward to hearing more from the room in terms of what you just offered. And Kathy, did you have your hand?
I was just going back to your first question, not reacting to that, but just like the idea of connectedness. So in terms of whether that be through a sport, whether that be through a club or something in school that kids, which is why we've really worked to try to make sure kids find something that they can belong in at school, because we feel like that lowers risk.
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's a lot of kids that I think about that might have little protective factors, but because of those other, you know, that sense of belonging or connectedness at school are doing really well.
To move them over a little bit. Okay, and is that what you meant in terms of the work that you feel like you're doing in Greece, in terms of identifying more of the spaces in where there's disproportionality and being able to address it in a multitude of ways?
Yeah, and I think just the different data points that we've delved into, where we haven't really like segregated the data that way before.
Okay.
And just seeing it across multiple data points and multiple experiences.
Okay, so I could go through all 4 of these spaces, all of the quadrants, right? And we could probably work to identify different students in Greece that live in these spaces. The reason why I'm bringing all of this forth is to simply ask, where is our disconnect? So where is this disconnect between being able to clearly identify these students who are in these different quadrants, right? Some of them may not need to be moved. Some of them are just fine. They have low vulnerability. That's a good place to be. But at the end of the day, most of our students where we're struggling, most of the students that are showing up in disproportionate numbers in terms of suspensions, in terms of being referred to special ed, right? Somewhere there's a space between what we can actually execute to change those numbers, how parents actually feel about this, right? Because this is Parent University. This is an opportunity to hear from the other adults in our children's lives, right? And also what is actually happening in the district. And so the work I really want us to think about is making a stronger connection between those 3 spaces for those 3 people. And when I walk through buildings, what I'm seeing is a huge effort to really address disproportionality, problems with racist attitudes, right? There is an effort to make those shifts in the district. Yet I know from our last Parent University that there was a struggle where parents weren't sure that was happening and students aren't sure that's happening. So we have to question why and what's happening in this void, which is why not only I offer this access, but use it as an opportunity to start having the discussion. Who is where and why, okay? So I have asked the adults who have engaged with CRE the following questions. Ask yourself these questions before making decisions or drawing conclusions about the students and families you serve. What I plan to ask the parents tonight is, do you feel like this is the understanding the adults in Greece have, the effort they've made to understand your families, understand your children, in a way that makes sense for you, a way to stand in the gap in terms of changing disproportionality, shifting the numbers in Greece? And have parents done any of this work on the other side to really make sure the adults in the buildings understand their children better as well? Did they feel like that was their responsibility? Did they feel like it was something they could do? Was their voice being heard in buildings in a way that was effective? So what I'm looking for is more information regarding this. Do the adults in the room, the parents specifically, do you feel like this encompasses more of a way in which the adults in Greece could understand your children? And I'm identifying two moms. If there are more, great. I'm a board member, right? So I want to hear from you all. The question is, do you feel like this sums up a way in which Greece has tried to address your child's needs, right? Try to know your child in a more holistic way, right? Because at the top I'm saying, ask yourself the following questions before making decisions or drawing conclusions about the students and families you serve. And I'm going to add that for the adults who work in the district, if you feel like that's happening, then how does it help you improve or start to dismantle disproportionality? So that's a separate question for the adults who are actually working in Greece. But for the parents, I think your silence is speaking to me in terms of how you really feel about this, but I'm hoping that you can give it some language.
I'm not sure. I don't really understand the question.
Okay, so do you feel like the teachers that come in contact with your students, with your child, do you feel like they've asked these questions about who your child is? Do you think that that's interesting, that that's information that the teachers in Greece would want to know about your child? Let me say it goes for you. Do you feel like those questions were ever asked about your child? Say it's something about referral. Say it's something about, you know, we just need to have this discussion about behavior. Yes or no?
I haven't had those issues.
Okay.
So I think if I were to say something, it would be, you know, I think that there are a couple realities that exist in Greece, right, for students of color. And that is, you have some that, you know, might be a part of the disproportionate numbers, and then you have some that aren't. So if I were to think about it from the perspective of my actual children and what has been my experience, I haven't had the referral issues. And it could be too because my kids are, you know, still young, you know, and they're coming through, but I know referrals happen even at the elementary level, so maybe that's not a good explanation. But I haven't had that experience. So I think when we have this discussion, we have to remember that, you know, all kids of color don't fall into these categories. And there are some parents like myself that feel like, you know, I'm a very strong advocate for my child. So I don't know if I give teachers enough room to even, I'm giving you all the information day one. I'm there day one. So you don't have to wonder about my family because I'm showing up on the first day. I'm telling you what she can eat. I'm telling you how we live, how she studies, that I support you as a teacher. I want to be on your team. This is what we project from day one consciously because this is just, you know, how as a family we have consciously decided we were going to move forward. So I think my perspective, I'm silent because I don't want to minimize the fact that there are some folks that might be struggling and their experience might be different. But, yeah.
So I'm like Sharita. I'm an advocate for my kids from day one, right? So I'm a little different because I've had an experience where referrals was given to my son in kindergarten. So even though I am an advocate, day one, this is my children. I'm telling you what they will, what's gonna happen, what can happen in the classroom if you don't follow these rules and stuff, whatever, we're giving you. But I had that experience. Even though I was that parent, I was experiencing the referral situation at a young age. And we had to really step up our advocacy to ensure that he was successful. The other children, I have not had that per se referral. I mean, they've been fine along the way, but the first kid, we had to really step up our advocacy to the district to say, you will not categorize my son based on what you see or what you see him doing based on the color of his skin. Even though we didn't say it in that way, that's what we was telling you when we came to those meetings and sitting in that room to the 150 people that was trying to tell us how our kid should be or where he should be going or what class placement he should be. If that, because I'm kind of like torn because I had the experience, but the experience is not one that I sit and make a big hoorah about. Like, you know what I mean? Like, really, I don't know how to say, like, I don't make a big, because we did what we had to do. We did what we did because that's our son, and we knew our son. So nobody in this district was going to tell us anything different based on what they saw in referrals, I don't know, conversations, whatever they said in their classrooms. We knew our son, and we knew what he was capable of doing. So, we struggled to hear it, but we knew it wasn't him, so we fought for him so that he could be successful in what he's doing now.
So, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's the difference though, because I have the privilege of not having to show up day one and be there and put that out on the table first day. So when people look at my daughter on the first day of school or look at her name on a class list, they're not making assumptions. I don't have to be there. I am there because that's who I am. But I feel like if you didn't show up day one and you weren't there advocating, it might not be the same experience.
So my concern is definitely right about, if we're talking about disproportionality, we know that what's happening is your experiences, especially if you're saying this has not been a norm for you at all, and yes, your children are small, but we also do realize these things are happening on the elementary level, is that, right, we're addressing this for all of our students, right? We're definitely not addressing it for one or two families. I pointed to you two as moms, but I think what I want to offer to the larger group, adults who work in the district and adults who are raising children in the district, or maybe some who are doing both, is that the way to look at disproportionality is not when you identify, again, that one student, even though I've asked you to do that here for the sake of the exercise, it's more about understanding how to change that narrative for all of the students. And more importantly, what is missing that it's not happening in a way that you see as immediate, right, which is a dream. It's not how it works, right? It's a lot of kids and a lot of minds to shift. But what, again, can happen in that gap? Like, what is missing in terms of either a discussion around issues of how we see the children, to your point, the difference between having to show up, maybe, and maybe you don't feel like that. I would feel similarly, where I'd be nervous if I did not, right? There are too many assumptions made about the students that we serve based on what they look like. And that's what the citation showed us. We understood that that's what disproportionality is all about. So I really want you all to continue thinking about this somewhat as an aggregate, not because there has to be deficit thinking around who our children are, but to who the black children are in this district, but to shift that thinking around any child and make sure that they understand that I'm here, but it shouldn't matter if I am. You should be able to see who my child is for who they are, regardless, and what they bring to the classroom. So what I do want us to do is, again, look at differential vulnerability in terms of the fact that all humans are vulnerable. We understand that. I'm sort of on vulnerability because as we unpack disproportionality, that's a root cause of it, right? If you're not understanding vulnerability in the equation, then you won't be able to address it. Schools can both provide protective factors and exacerbate risk factors. And that's the part that I want us to be hyper aware of. We have so little control in the rest of the world in terms of how our children are impacted by daily experiences. In our buildings, we actually do. And so speaking to the adults who work in the building is one thing. Helping the parents to understand what that looks like for you is another. And the connection and the partnership that you make to examine again and dismantle disproportionality in your district, you all become key. We need to ensure that schools' protective factors are there for all students. And as I mentioned in the other parent university, I feel like that part of the conversation can get lost in sort of addressing the needs of one group, just the Black kids or the changing demographics in Greece. But that's not how we're approaching it here. And that part has to be held as sacred too, because that means that every child, no matter what they look like, actually has something of value to share with the other. And as is, it's seen as, well, we have to support the Black kids, right, to create equity. You are incredibly supporting all of the students in Greece when everyone understands the value that each child brings. So, what I will ask you to do, right, besides this, because that's, if you turn over your papers now, and we have some decent sized groups at the tables. I don't think we really need to move around. And we have 2 parents in the room. And then I'm actually gonna ask a little bit if you can move on this side, because this is my Grease heavy side in terms of, I appreciate that, I really do. I take it as a personal favor. And so what I want you guys to do is, once you turn over your sheets, start to share out on how you would answer each piece. All right, everybody, so if we could come back together. You've taken now about 10 minutes, and I want to start with the group question that would pertain to when you were here last. And I know this group in the back had it. So, and if there's something that they offer that came up in your group, because I know this group has. No, I'm in. We're going to follow up in order, but we'd like you guys to get us started with, if you could read your question and then talk about a little bit of what you were able to gather as a group.
Oh, are we done? You on that?
I'm sorry.
Okay. As a result of our last meeting, what role do you see yourself playing in dismantling disproportionality? What have you done? What courageous conversations have you had?
All right, I'll jump in.
We kind of did it at the same time. I'm sorry.
Who has that question, by the way? This table has that question. Okay, good. So no one over here has that question, even though you guys were at the last meeting. But okay, give it to us.
So I'll tell you my conversation I had with Sharita, and at first I offended her, but then we had a discussion, which is
Never
good.
offended.
I know, okay. So I teach for city school.
I said never offended. It's an education moment.
We respectfully disagree. So I teach for city schools. I also serve on the school board and Spencer board, just for full disclosure. And I was talking about in my classroom how careful I have to be. You got me on camera? Oh, jeez. So how careful I have to be with the students in my class that are Black and brown and in between about the possible, maybe some microaggressions or implicit bias I might have. I gotta be extremely careful because I'm a teacher, right? So, and I am very careful. And I specifically try to overly treat every kid equally. And the one example I gave was, if I'm ever telling a story about a situation that involved children or parents of whatever, a multicultural situation, more times than not, a student would ask me, well, what color were they, right? They're onto this. And my canned response is, I didn't notice. And they don't understand that, because I see situations, how people treat people, the way people treat people, right? Not because of the color of your skin. So, you know, to comment that, you know, and I'm not trying to straight on the spot, but she didn't want that comment to be discrediting the richness of someone's culture. And she agreed that she understood that, and I'm glad she brought that up. And that's the second point, is that a lot of people can't articulate that don't discredit my culture, right? I'm just seen as a person.
And discrediting the culture by way of
saying
omission.
I didn't notice what color you were.
Right, so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't see
yeah.
it.
I'm not
It's
erasing
part
your
of the
black.
story.
I'm not erasing your black. I'm just saying it doesn't matter why you asked me their color. It's about what person A did to person B.
So, and just to support what he was saying, one of my pet peeves is when people say, oh, I don't see color. Then you don't see me. And that's disheartening because I'm beautiful.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Now, and I don't mean physically. I mean everything that I am. Everything that I am has come from my experience, and that is part of my culture, right? Part of my being an African American woman. You know, this is who I am, right? So what I said, you know, I understand I don't see color means I'm not going to treat you differently. You don't have to worry about me being disparaging. I get where it comes from. But I think that, you know, we're turning a corner now where we can have a different conversation, where we can have the conversation that says, I see your color and I, you know, see it as a part of you. Because being African American is not a bad thing. Being black is not a bad thing. I was never raised that way. You know, there's such beautiful parts of our culture. And when I think about even Greece and, you know, us having our Black History Month celebration and our Black Scholars celebration, it was an opportunity to celebrate the fact that there are parts of your culture. Our students got to express themselves and, you know, show parts that other people don't see all the time. And when you can look at students as more than just an outside picture, but that their color is related to other things, talent and intellect and scholarship, so on and so forth, then you can really embrace them. It's really, I mean, to me, it's really about seeing their humanity. And that's all of who you are, good, bad, indifferent, all of it. So that's what I meant by that. It didn't offend me because I am,
well taken,
I'm, you know, used to it, but I am proactively turning the corner with anybody that has a conversation with me. When they say, I don't see color, I'm jumping in and saying, I need you to see me. Yeah.
Okay. So that's colorblind ideology, right? Where it's like, no, I treat all of my students the same. I treat all of the people in my neighborhood the same, at the grocery store the same. And to your point, Greece, right, got an opportunity to see, no, they're not all the same, but now you get this more holistic picture of who we are, including who we are racially. And that matters in terms of dismantling disproportionality, because we ended up there when someone decided not to see it or to see it in a very negative way. And so that is the beauty of that conversation, right? Being able to say, and I can't remember your first name, sir, but like when you're in the classroom,
Dave.
Say it again?
Dave.
Dave, was there ever a reason why you felt like you did not want to see the color, you wanted to stick with more of just who the students or the people in the story were with other identifiers? Like, why was it harder to attach? And because it doesn't harder. It doesn't sound like it was a struggle for you. It sounds like you just now in practice don't include race as an identifier, and I'm asking why.
Yeah. I think just being a teacher, you have to be a role model for these things. You don't know where these kids are getting their information from in a general sense. So for me, as the instructional leader and the role model in the classroom, I try to display that, because I just can't take sides with race in no way, because you're going to get killed. So I don't.
So even in, right, and this isn't for you, this is for everyone. So even in just identifying Emily as a black woman who also works at NYU, who's also a daughter and a mom and likes to think she's still a biker, right? Like all these pieces about who Emily is, if we include race, then you're saying it's like a minefield.
Could be.
Okay. And can someone else support, right? Because Dave is not the only person, right? Or else I wouldn't be standing in front of you. And also, it's just interesting to imagine how, I think to your point around I'm turning a corner, why we ever lived there, right? I will help you with that a little bit and remind you that that's very post-civil rights. So post-civil rights legislation was, we're gonna make everything equal. No one sees color anymore, right? And that message was very, not only misunderstood, but it just kind of got mixed in terms of like post-Black power, then you just didn't see black anymore. It was, you know, it's very interesting, but it's very much a decade approach. And now turning a corner, I think it's interesting to wonder how we ever still live there. It's 2019. I think that's what's always surprising. I'm like, it's 2019. So I want us all to hold on to a moment of when we've done that for the sake of safety. Because Dave's also talking about work. And I'm here because of your jobs, right? I'm here because of your children and the people who serve your children. So that's just an interesting place to live. And we want to say, like, okay, how can we start to unpack that? Because that is dismantling disproportionality. When we do that, we start to clear away some of the clutter in terms of why we never even include racial identification as something that could be good. It doesn't have to be a minefield. It will stay a minefield if we never have the discussion. Okay? So was there anything else at your table offered in terms of, I think courageous conversation was mentioned. Anything else in terms of post our last meeting?
Well, one of the things that I had mentioned that I noticed was kind of important, what we all were saying. I guess it's also that, to kind of sum it up, the first impression of the explanation of what you mean. Because they've had enough experience to just have a casual conversation. Sometimes kids are too young and they have an emotional conversation instead of having an open mind to casually conversate.
About issues of race or,
yep.
Okay. And I really appreciate that distinction between like an emotional conversation and a more informed discussion. I think the truth is, even for adults, it is still very emotional, especially because it's the thing that most of us have been taught to not, in any capacity, discuss it, right? Because not only has it been unsafe, but no one knows what to do. So we feel really awkward, and when we feel really awkward, I'm just gonna go over here, right? So I really appreciate that part coming out in your conversation, because I know there are other folks in the room who can identify with that. So thank you for that. So if that's some of what, and did anyone else have that question regarding post our last meeting? Okay. So if we know that that was going on post our last meeting, and I'd be interested to hear what happened for folks if they were here in the last meeting. I want to come to this table, and if you could read out your question for me.
How have GCSD adults increased risk and/or protective factors for students in the district?
Okay, give that to me one more time, because I think I don't know if everybody heard it.
How have GCSD adults increased risk and/or protective factors for students in the district?
Okay, so how have we, right, thinking about that, the vulnerability axis. How, I'm just reading it for folks in the back. How have GCSD adults increased risk and or protective factors for students in the district? Okay. Do you want to read the second part?
Sure. Oh, and as a result of the positive interaction, have you been able to let your guard down?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was part of, okay. All right, so can you tell me a little bit of?
So we kept coming back to not individual adults, but more systems and structures that are in place. Okay. So it never came back to individuals, and we thought that was interesting, that that's where we kept going to. But
can you guys hear that?
Sorry.
Okay. All right.
So for the increased protective factors, we talked about increasing access to trusting adults via the foster grandparents program, Big Brothers Big Sisters. We talked about access to services such as the Family Support Center, meeting students' basic needs, like if you're thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, providing free breakfast and lunch, working with community partners, and then other things that are in place like McKinney-Vento to help students to kind of protect them and help decrease their risk. And then when we talked about increasing risk factors, we talked about some inequitable access to services and programs throughout the district. So for instance, pre-K, if you're not able to transport your child, they're not able to access that resource. If families don't have transportation of their own, they can't access other resources like some after-school programming or educare. And then we just talked about kindergarten in and of itself, and the fact that by having like the December 1st cutoff, that forces the hand of families whether they should send their child or not send their child, and they don't have those choices. So many of us at the table work in early childhood or early elementary, and so that's kind of where our conversation led.
Okay. So can anyone in the room, and especially your table, because you had the question, can anyone in your room anyone in this room imagine what I'm thinking would be a really big way in which Greece may be increasing risk right now? It's already been unpacked in the room a little bit, but I'm just wondering if, okay, we don't have to, I don't have to hide the ball. So when we're talking about how we have a professional who still feels like it's a real struggle to have these conversations with students about race, yet the same adult is clear, these students know. If we are not able to do whatever system we have to put in place, whatever book group, whatever piece of, whatever paragraph we need to introduce to the discussion, that's one way, right? I mean, and I'm saying that's one thing that's important. The students have to know that you see them. And if Sharita, is Sharita or Sarita? Sharita. If Sharita says you're not seeing me because you didn't address who I am racially, you're missing a huge chunk of me, so much so that it really kind of impacts all of who I am. That's not her by herself. Your students feel that way. So one way in which we increase risk is when you don't see the child, right? So I want to make that connection because that's going to be key for Greece adults, and it's going to be key for parents to maybe stand in that gap a little bit, because you all provide the protection for your children and the adults in this moment uniquely. It's very rare that a structure is set up that way, but that's true in schools, especially around really tough discussions. When there's a tough discussion, we call the parent. This is a tough discussion. So the partnerships that may have to be aligned around this, we're gonna have to think about that. So that's a way that we increase risk. Another way that risk is increased in that moment is when the adults, right, which is the question that I think we had over here at this table, are not thinking about their own racial identity in terms of how they engage with the students. Another moment of parent partnership. So we don't want to leave professionals in a space of, I don't know how to do this. We've done the CRE work that said, let's look at how you understand your own identity and how it impacts the students you engage with. Why? Because it directly impacts vulnerability and risk. So those are two ways in which we know we're increasing or decreasing risk. Okay, so I want us as a group to hold on to the ways in which we engage with that differently. All right, so the second part of your conversation, question is about
positive interactions and if you've been able to let your guard down. So, do you want to?
As a white parent of a white child, I brought it up to these ladies that I am a parent, but I haven't raised my hand yet. And they said it speaks volumes to your white privilege. I haven't had any issues with both of my girls, you know, going through the Greece Central system. But I'm here just to learn what's going on in our community and see what's going on with children who aren't as fortunate as my children have been.
okay.
So I have let my guard down as compared to some other parents who may not have. So that's kind of where we went with that.
And helping each other stand in that space and be vulnerable about these discussions of race, whether you're a white mom of white children, a white mom of black children, a black parent of white children, right? All of that happens in Greece, right? But, and I appreciate you guys introducing the concept of privilege just in this discussion, right? Because privilege it's tricky right now, right? It brings about a lot of feelings of, really? Because I didn't know that. My paycheck didn't tell me I was privileged, right? I mean, like, that's the instant connection. But what we're really saying is that there's an underlying moment of, I actually have had good experiences here, and I'm wondering why other groups haven't. And how can I make it so that I use my privilege as it exists in this district to support other families where, right, they're my contemporaries, they're raising girls here too, they're raising boys here. How can I make it so that they have a similar or a similarly good experience as I've had, right? That's your parent work. That's your ally, okay? So thank you for that, everyone here at the table. I really don't want us to lose that connection between what was offered here and what was offered here. So I'm gonna go, okay, you guys had a similar, well, for that reason, can you guys give us a little bit?
Sure. So I guess if I can start with the second one.
Okay.
So,
and they had the same question.
Yep, so as a result of a positive interaction, have you been able to let your guard down? So I was an assistant principal for many years, and the thing I feared most was for a student or a parent to call me racist.
And I think many times over those years, I would just say, no, I'm not, you're crazy, you didn't, I mean, I wouldn't say that, but, you know, I would think that and just move on, that this issue is not about race, it's about your naughty child. And through our training, I, you know, kind of got the courage to say something. So the next time a parent or a student said that to me, I said, you know what, let's talk about that. And I have done that now since several times with students and parents, and the conversations have been so rich and so meaningful, and I've learned so much about their story, not just the story that I had created for them. So I would say that because of those positive interactions, I've been able to let my guard down in a number of other ways that I wouldn't have been able to before.
Can you just say that last piece, Gina, around the story I created? I want everybody to hear that again.
Sure. So by actually having conversations with students and parents of color, I was able to find out the real story, not just the story that I created for them.
So the story created, right, is about power, right? And there's still such a strong power dynamic that's present in buildings. I mean, that's just an American context. You walk into a school building, we know who's in charge all the way through, right? Until you get to the kids, right? They're just down here somewhere. And it's about age, it's about traditions, it's about the way we understand children should be seen and not heard. All of that we know is really changing in a lot of ways, but it's truly one generation away from us in terms of, you know, the picture of the old schoolhouse. And with that said, it's still very natural for even contemporary school building leaders to have to like shift their thinking. Did I just like create that story about them? I missed a whole chunk of information based on my norm of, I'm the building leader and I'm going to direct what happens here. So challenging yourself in your work, in your practice, right? And if it involves you having to look at how you understood that child in terms of their race, then that's good work, right? It can't be something that you avoid, because then you just, I mean, you can secretly also continue to address it if that's something you need to do privately, but the work is really in system changes that happen when you share your best practices, which Gina just did, okay? So is there, yes, another piece?
Just to add to that, I guess I will say that it's easy to avoid, very easy, and you know, you can do it for years and years and not ever have to think about it, and because you're in a power position, not only because of your actual position in the building, but for me, because of my whiteness. I can do that and no one is going to judge me or call me out, but that has changed. Someone is going to call me out now and should, and that's the new conversation that we're having.
And I also want to bring us back to that moment of Gina saying, like, you know, if a parent called me a racist, it was like the worst thing. So you are not alone, right? Most folks, like, right, it's the George Bush, Kanye West moment on national TV, right? Like, all of a sudden it was like, oh, like, like, you could have called the man a murderer. I mean, you could have called him something really sick, and that would have been better than calling him a racist. I mean, George Bush, like, completely melted down over that comment. And so that goes to show you how powerful issues of racism steeped in our very, very rich and current history in America, how critical they are to our being. We are in this. And if we weren't, we wouldn't have someone as young and vibrant and contemporary as Gina saying, I thought it was the worst thing somebody could call me. It just wouldn't be the case. So you have to really rethink how you step into your roles and what makes you the most afraid. And in terms of this discussion, I know Gina's not the only one who can really say, oh, I absolutely dreaded that. We've already heard that from other professionals in the room in different roles, but right, it's playing, it bubbles up. Hence disproportionality, hence vulnerability, hence this missing moment of an axis where we could be decreasing risk, increasing protective factors, but minus the discussion about who our students really are and all that they embody, you know, our numbers are going to stay the same. So we've gone from that question shared. What do you guys have? Okay. Okay, Kathy, what's your question again? Oh no, you all are supposed to be giving it to us. Don't sneak out now. Come on. All right. Give us something and just give us that piece, and then we want to go from here to there.
And then we'll let them go.
You're like, darn.
How has identity for adults/students impacted disproportionality in Greece? And she made me promise to talk. So basically we talked essentially about our workforce and the fact that most of our teachers in our classrooms are white. Most are white middle-class females. Most define a lot, like sort of like they've defined everything based on their white middle-class upbringing, and it sort of goes back to, I mean, really sort of the bigger concept around white supremacy, really, and just the fact that everything is normed based on this white world, and that's really where most of our teachers have grown up. So so I think the way we see kids it then creates disproportionality, because they are, and I say that they, and I mean we, because I mean we're a system. I use the example when we look at our social emotional report card data. And so, and this is a terrible example. It's like the worst thing that I share, and I'm sharing it out loud, but when we changed our report card work habits to match up with the social emotional competencies, we did that very intentionally to get us to be more explicit about the work. We also did it explicitly so that we could track the data. And what we found, and I may not have it perfectly right, was like, I think it was 10 out of 11 of our schools, our youngest students, our youngest black students, none of them were in like the mastery category, which told me something around the way we're seeing kids. So that just takes me back to who, from an identity perspective, who do we have in front of kids, and how that plays into then how do we see kids. Because I can't believe that out of all of our kindergartners, there's really no one that really fits that mastery category. Like, that blows my mind. So that was a lot of our conversation in terms of just the middle-class white female. And well-intentioned, but it matters in terms of how we see.
So you mentioned a few things that are really compelling, and I want us again to make these connections for the group. You intentionally and over again put yourself back in it, right? And you are our district leadership. If we had to pick someone out the room, we got our superintendent in the room, right? Who decided to put herself in the conversation around the demographic of leadership, the demographic of teacher, and who we are, who are we putting in front of our children, right? And how do they understand all that our superintendent embodies, all of our different professionals? Who are they, right? And how do they identify themselves? And then, as I said to the table when we were talking about the question, the space that's created between the two of us, once the child begins to recognize who they are, like how they can self-identify, and then what it means for those waves to come together. So if anyone's ever been to South Africa, which is also a very interesting place for this to happen, there's a point where the oceans meet. So it's the Indian and the Atlantic, if I'm not mistaken. And it's how you would imagine, oceans meeting. Whoosh, like, I mean, you can't get too close to it. It's just so explosive, right? However, there is a moment when the ocean goes back out and there's a little bit of calm for like 2 seconds. And I offer that metaphor because I feel like that's what happens when we're trying to engage students and they seem really different. They seem really different. It's two bodies of water. It's two humans. Yet we're coming to that engagement, right, from a position of power and with a very narrow definition of success or mastery. And when we do that, the child who looks the least like me, right, if I were the white woman who was in charge of these students in Greece, right, if I'm a first grade teacher all the way to my soup, how do I work to make sure I still find that calm, I still find that way to come back to you, right, and see you enough to recognize more of who you are. Again, Sharita's point, like, see all of me, right? You can't have my race quietly be the thing that over-influences every decision you make about me academically. And that, again, is what's happening with disproportionality, and that has to do with how people understand their own identity, and again, how it engages with the students who look a little different. sound a little different, come from different places, could be a different gender. I only taught boys. I always had classrooms where I had like 1 or 2 girls, maybe in a year. And I kind of knew my strength. It was a struggle for me with the girls. And they actually, I mean, I am a girl, but that wasn't a point of identification that made sense for me professionally. At the very least, own it. And if we start to still disregard a conversation around race, you're never gonna get to ownership around where you are really successful and where you struggle, okay? So one, I appreciate you all being able to identify how you see yourselves individually, and then how you engage with those who are changing in Greece, as we like to say. So let's keep holding each other to that as we get to this table right here. No, you guys went already.
If you want, if you want us to.
No, we talked about it a little bit, but if you can give us this final question, because then I want to make this larger connection for you guys.
Go ahead and read it. Oh, okay. I'll read it. How have you understood to manifest in Greece?
So we talked to the table that I would answer the question for my team. So, you know.
Who said that? You got that in your head.
I know, listen. So obviously I have a different perspective as the district, the Director of Pupil Services for the district and how it's manifested here. So as you mentioned, Emily, earlier, it began with manifesting just in a citation where it became that shift to awareness, right? You can't look at the data and kind of not see it. So for us, it manifested as an over-representation of students with disabilities who were suspended and removed from school more than their general ed peers. And in addition to that, students with disabilities who were Black, suspended from school, disproportionate not only to gen ed students, but to other special ed students suspended who may not have been Black. So for us, as Michelle kind of mentioned, as the team mentioned, we dig into the data more and more, and how it's manifesting for us is looking overall at equity. So for us, disproportionality is over and under representation in our district. So as Jeff commented, you walk into an AP class and you might see a sea of white faces and 2 Black students. You walk into a typical general education classroom and you see a more even representation of race. And ethnicity too, but we're talking about race here for a lot of this. And then you walk into a self-contained special education classroom in our district, and there are, the majority of those students are Black students, and they're Black boys. So for us, more of those general ed sort of settings where kids are not segregated and they need extra support aren't as disproportionate. They look like a typical classroom. But for those kids who are really at risk and those kids who we typically service in special ed, there's an overrepresentation of those students that are Black and boys.
So not only was that a clear manifestation in terms of like actually what disproportionality means in the district, but there were some faces attached to that description, right? I think another, and I just want to add that I think another manifestation again is this is a term that I'm even struggling with because I know how many things are shifting in the district. But disproportionality existing before we named it, right? So some complicity, some understanding of what's happening, but then, okay, right, but then we name it and it's an opportunity to address it, right? So that really brings me to what is all the reason why we would even bother with this exercise. So before we leave here tonight, no one needs to go, well, okay, it was a parent university and we discussed disproportionality again, but why? Like, what are we doing here? I want to get back to the mom's statement around, you know, like, okay, I need to know more. I need to know, like, what am I supposed to do now? Is there something to do? Well, one, of course, there always is something to do. And my only push here, following such a really robust discussion, and so I thank you all for that, is to not only think about this axis, right? It's nice and it's a visual, right? But I want us to think about not asking for permission, right? Because I've got professionals who are like, how is this supposed to happen? How am I supposed to avoid this minefield of discussing race? How am I supposed to not be called a racist by my parents? Couple things, you probably will be called a racist by a parent. there's probably something that we've all done that was racist, not on purpose. You are well-intentioned folks. You've studied hard to be where you are. You work hard to keep the jobs you have. You like the work you do. However, everyone wants to do it better. Everyone wants to have a better day, right here in Greece. And we know we can create that for all of our students when we literally step up and say, okay, so this is happening, and I need to, start with just my local, right? Everything comes down to politics is all local, right? So it all comes down to this moment of when you start to engage in either that more difficult conversation with your student, when you finally say, no, we had a moment today in the CRE training where someone gave a description of a story about something that happened in the city, which you guys call Rochester, and she didn't want to name the race of the person. And it was very obvious to me, Kelly, and whoever else was in the room, the folks who were facilitating, that there was a race to this person, and it mattered in terms of the story, because it mattered in terms of how her family member reacted to that person in Rochester. And so what I want to say is those are the moments that you can instantly start to dispel these moments of anxiety around how to discuss race. There's no right way to discuss race. There's no right way to discuss identity and ethnicity and how I feel about you and how you feel about me. The only thing that's wrong is when we don't have the discussion at all. And, because everybody's filled with a lot of love for these students and a lot of I actually like most of them. You don't love all your kids, that's fine. But you like a whole bunch of them, and that's good. And the ones that you don't absolutely love, you find a way to connect. You do. So, there are other pieces of their identity that have to matter in order to have richer, more robust, and more rigorous, academically, experiences with them. And so there's no silver bullet that NYU ever offers. I can't then bring up the slide where I show you all the ways in which you can get in. But I bet you right now, if I asked you, who was a former athlete in here? Did anybody ever? And Jeremy and I actually had a whole discussion about lacrosse versus other sports today. It was a whole thing. And if I needed to engage, I would instantly know one way to get in with him. Right now. So what I'm offering is, that's not lost in terms of this conversation around race. People in positions of power, you have the power to step in and do that. Don't wait for Sharita to do it. Don't wait for me to do it. Don't wait for Tasha to do it. Don't wait for Kelly to do it. I've named all the black people in the room. Wait. Oh, Lucas. Don't wait for Lucas to do it. That's funny. They're like, what? Is that Freudian? All I'm offering is, I've named folks who could do it. Usually it's a given because we're the black folks in the room. Why? You don't know what to say because you're a white mom. You don't know what to say because you're the soup and you don't want to get in trouble. Our soup has already stood in the room and said, when Emily and Miss Ali are here, I feel like shit. She said it. It's done. It's over. So now, everyone else, that was your hall pass. Where do we go with injecting a more robust conversation that can happen when you take that up individually? So that's what we're hoping can happen. When I come back, the only question that should be asked is the one that says, what'd you do?
I just wanted to add, I also would hope, my vision would be that, don't be afraid to make a mistake in the conversation. We're not perfect people, no matter what color you are, so there are going to be times, there are times when I make a mistake, I'm having a conversation with someone and I might say something that is completely off base. I'll give an example. I had a class the other night I was teaching. I heard, thinking I'm cool because I teach college students, so I try to be hip, And so I heard someone say Rabbi Google, we'll use Rabbi Google. I was watching a video, I heard that. So in my class, I asked the question, they didn't know the answer. So I'm like, why don't you guys try Rabbi Google? And I had a student that said, who's Jewish in the room that's offended right now? I felt like crap. If I could have melted and slid out the room, I would have. Because I didn't even think, what kind of connotation that might have. And I was worried. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get emails, that's it, no job. I was worried, I was concerned about it. I didn't know how to correct it. You're just in that moment where Do I say, oh, I didn't mean it, or do I just skip over it? I skipped over it. You know, the person stood up, said, who's Jewish in the room that's offended? No one said anything. You know, I just took a minute and I said, okay, who's got the answer? Just kept it moving, right? But I was nervous. I couldn't even sleep that night. I knew my chair was gonna get me the next morning. Like, did you say this? Like, nothing has happened, thank God. Please don't report me. But it just goes to show, right, that sometimes you can make a mistake. And I think in our professions as educators or in life, there's not a lot of, we don't give ourselves opportunities to make mistakes. We feel like we got to get it perfect all the time. And when we don't do that, we do a disservice to our community and to our children. You know, they know more than we think that they know, and they're able to have conversations. I asked my son, I said, can you handle this? When we sat down, he said, I got this, Mom. I want to be here. So be okay to have the conversation. If you have people in a room that don't look like you, that are part of your network, you guys share one thing. You know, we're all one district. And if you need to have a difficult conversation with someone, you know, that is a person of color, you reach out and say, look, this might sound so stupid, but I need to ask you something. I've got these kids in my class, you know, kids of color, and, you know, this happened, or, you know, use each other. You know, we have Emily, and she's a wealth of knowledge, but Emily goes away. And then we're like panting, when is she coming back? When is the next? And you have resources here. It doesn't just have to be the teachers of color. There are a lot of people that have compassion and understanding and have been doing this work. We have wealth right here that we can build on. So again, my vision is that we use each other, be okay to make a mistake, and when you make the mistake, you know, just give yourself that room to say, you know what, I'm gonna try better. I'm never saying Rabbi Google again, I promise, ever, ever, right? Except here right now on camera, delete that. But you know, it was a teachable moment for me, and we always have to be checking ourselves no matter what color you are, because this is the kind of world I want him to inherit and her to inherit, right? Where it's okay to make a mistake and to have the conversation. So.
Thank you for that. And to your point, right, to own it. Everybody can own it. And that equalizes, right? Talk about equity. That equalizes your power. So from professor to student, from principal to family, right? Then we start to see a real dismantling of disproportionality because we're balancing out power, which is key in 2019. These children know, as you guys have already offered, and we do want them to inherit a space where we recognize that they know, right? So thank you again so much for everything. And we really hope that if there is feedback, more questions, more inquiry, more like, how should we connect? Not with me, because to Sharita's point, there's a ton of, I'm thinking about your husband, just in the ways in which he really wanted to engage with the adults in the district, right? Lean on each other. No one has to step out on that limb by themselves. No, and it still feels like a limb, right? No one has to do this work by themselves. So your resources are vast, right? Tap into it. Be willing to have more of a vulnerable conversation, even if it starts, maybe just Sharita met you for a Coke somewhere, some wine, but whatever is necessary. Oh, well, wine with me. Whatever it is, right? Make sure that you make that connection so Greece takes care of Greece. Thank you so much.